Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. K, and we're talking about Canada's role in World War I, or the Great War.
Mm-hmm.
Some people call it.
Yes.
So we've talked about some of the opening battles, we'll call them. But what about the Canadian victory at Vimy Ridge, which is one of the most well-known?
This is a very interesting thing, slightly controversial, I think, in the modern period. When I was at university, many years ago in the medieval period, most of the Canadian history profs were veterans of World War II, and so Vimy Ridge was really, spotlighted in Canadian history courses, and I've never really been all that comfortable with that because military history is great, and I'm very interested in the Great War, but I wouldn't ever go as far as to say that the Canadian nation was born because of Vimy Ridge, which is what quite a lot of military historians still argue. So, you think you can just get and judge for yourself, I guess. So by August of 1916, all 4 Canadian divisions were actually in France, and they're used together for the first time, all 4 of them together. In April of 1917, it's actually the Easter weekend of April 1917. And they're used together at Vimy Ridge, and they're under first Julian Byng, B-Y-N-G, who was later the Governor-General, and the Lady Byng Trophy is for gentlemanly conduct.
Gentlemanly conduct,
hockey.
Sportsmanlike.
That's right, yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's the connection.
Well.
And I remember many years ago, before you were my co-host, you drew me a picture of Julian Byng and the trophy. I don't know why, because we didn't know each other. But it was just a young lad came up to me and said, "Here's a picture of Julian Byng and the
Isn't
trophy."
that a gentlemanly thing to do?
It certainly was, and so I was quite impressed.
I was just trying to capture the spirit of the thing.
Exactly. So this whole thing about Vimy Ridge, then, it's a place I've been around, a German salient between Lens and Arras, and I actually was hitchhiking through France, and I got stuck on the highway.
So is this the Hitchhiker's Guide to History?
That's right, Hitchhiker's Guide to History. I'm stuck on their freeway system and I can't get off it, and I was scared to go across the fields in case I got blown up by any World War I armaments, because they're still there. So anyway, it's the Canadians versus the German 6th Army. So it's Julian Byng versus von Falkenhausen. Yes, very German sort of name. So Vimy Ridge, it's a 14-kilometer long ridge. It's just northeast of the town of Arras, and it was supposed to be impregnable, which is, it can't be taken, it won't fall. Oddly enough, it had fallen once before. French-Moroccan troops had held it briefly in 1915 and then promptly gone on to lose it again. And so it was used by the Germans to see to get a kind of bird's eye view of the entire region. And of course, then they could call down really accurate, deadly fire on the Allies. And it had actually been assaulted beaten up by the British and the French unsuccessfully on a number of occasions since 1914 when the war started. And by the spring of 1917, about 200,000 lives had been lost just trying to take this ridge. So it's seen not only as a great testing ground for Canadian soldiers who have already shown their mettle at Ypres and at the Somme, but it's kind of all planned by, it's not just fought by Canadians, it's the planning. We did the planning as well, so it's really interesting. So all 4 Canadian divisions, about 70,000 men there, so they built painstakingly detailed plans. They had very artistic, they had little models of the ridge with all the little caves and the little tunnels that they were going to use underneath it. They had, so it's kind of replicas of the terrain. They had spotted about 80% of the German guns, the gun positions, and they had built 5 kilometers worth of tunnels underneath to move troops and, of course, to bomb it, right? So they're mining it and to move stuff closer to the front. And so on April the 9th, they used about 1,100 cannons. Now, the fights usually start at 5:30 in the morning, so it'd probably be too early for you. You'd probably miss the whole thing. It'd be like Culloden all over again, all the Scottish soldiers sleeping in till noon and the whole thing's all over, So they start with an artillery barrage, and then they set off all the mines to blow up bits of the ridge. And they actually trained for 2 months under the now Canadian commander, Arthur Curry, and they had aerial surveillance shots. They had absolutely everything. And then the night before the attack, they all lay out in open trenches, and they were just freezing cold by morning, but that can never stop you, really. And as I said, they mined the German-held ridge. They had to fight through 3 lines of trenches. They moved about 90 meters every 5 minutes or so where possible, and within 4 days, they had won the ridge. And so a lot of Canadian historians talk about Canada becoming a nation as a result. This is the first time the 4 divisions are all together. It's Canadian planned, it's Canadian executed. So surely this means something. And actually a lot of people we've talked about this, were recent immigrants from Britain, and they still felt that they were just doing their part for the Allied cause. So I'm not really completely convinced that something that kills lots of people but is ultimately successful is really a good birth of a nation.
You have to look at it this way. Nothing brings Canadians together, current Canadians, like a good old team win.
A team win. So
look at any of the big
modern Olympics.
But Summit Series 2010 Olympics, people will be talking about that for ages. I think that's kind of along the lines of what.
So you think that's what it is? It's like
I
all
think it's
the
nothing
men.
More than that.
So
it
doesn't leave it. It leaves the women completely out, right? Because we're all like,
yeah,
all the men, we all fought together and we did this great thing.
But it's their men.
Country.
It's the women's men that are out there.
It's the women's men that are doing it. That's true. But I'm just not completely comfortable with it. But I do get it. And it has remained really, really important. And the government, of course, built a huge monument at Vimy. They didn't have to build it at Vimy. They had a bunch of places that they could choose, but because it was a ridge, it looks better there. And so they built it. And then they did actually, when it was open in the 1930s, they called it a national pilgrimage, which smacks of religious, kind of a national pilgrimage, a nation's pilgrimage to Vimy. And then the Queen rededicated it in 2007, I think. So, and it's a stunning monument, absolutely stunning monument. So it has figured a lot in Canadian history, but I when I first took Canadian history, I just thought that's really odd. So Canada was kind of, and like any student anywhere, a student of history in general, or just a student of Canadian history, I thought, oh, good. So I'll never get examined on any of the stuff before that then. So it all kicked off on Easter Monday in 1917, but that's not a good way to look at it.
But it's the first, I guess, the first kind of real win for the nation.
For
and that's
Team Canada.
That's probably the building block of,
But it wasn't an independent nation at the
No,
time. But the
I know,
argument
but you
is that
take
this
what you
made it more like we should be an independent nation. Look, we just went over and we
You're
did
there
this
with all the big boys?
went over and did this incredible thing. Contemporary German military sources said that they weren't really all that upset that it wasn't such a great loss, but they could just have been, trying to poo-poo the Canadian victory. They said that it was a draw because although the Canadians took the ridge, there was no further Allied movement into German-held territory, so they were like,
pretty sure they don't have ties in the war.
I don't think so. They're like, we lost that bit.
we were 2-0-1 in World War I. Pretty good, undefeated.
Well, it does make the Germans change their
5
strategy.
of a possible 6 points.
Yes. It's like the 9th end or 10th end of curling or something. Let's just keep going until we get something good. I wonder if they stopped at the end of the 5th thing for snacks, like the Canadian women curlers do. I don't remember ever seeing the men's championship stopping for snacks. We probably don't watch curling. When I watched it, I was like, really? They're having snacks? Wow, that's interesting. Reminded me of soccer, when the mums have to slice up the oranges and give them out at halftime. Anyway, the Germans decided that instead of counterattacking, they would just use the scorched earth policy in that area. But, Canadians back at home are absolutely, as you said, overjoyed at the victory at Vimy Ridge. And so it was really built upon as a national symbol. This is where we all came together for the first time, ignoring the previous 15,000 years of Canadian history. No, it was just this. So I'm opposed to that kind of view personally, because I don't think that it should be a war that defines the birth of
15,000 years of Canadian history?
Yeah. Native history is Canadian history. Where have you
Okay,
been?
wow.
Under a rock? Golly. So, yeah. So there's, and of course, there's still, I think the last Vimy veteran died recently, but this is one from a few years ago. Just a lovely story. The veteran of Vimy Ridge dies at the age of 103. And the thing that's interesting and nice about it is that it says, before he reached the age of 18, he was amongst the Canadian soldiers who formed the creeping artillery barrage that took Vimy Ridge in Easter of 1917. Mr. Reaper survived that pivotal battle and lived for another 86 years until his death at the age of 103. But it says Mr. Reaper figured it was his long legs that got him to the front line. As a 16-year-old, he'd come to Canada in 1915 as a parentless lad from the Scottish county of Banffshire, and he was determined not to end up in an orphanage, so he fibbed about his age and enlisted in Vancouver, and he had a shrapnel wound that he recovered from at Vimy Ridge and went on to fight in the Third Battle of Ypres, and then went back home to Canada and became a bus driver in Winnipeg for the rest of his natural life. So,
Good for him.
So yeah, so there's lots of stuff about Vimy veterans. So there has been in the past, but of course they'll be shuffling off. You know, they'll be pretty old by now.
Yeah. So
If still alive.
any other glorious moments?
Oh, yes.
For Team Canada?
Yeah, Team Canada also did very well at the Battle of Passchendaele. Wonderful, wonderful name. It's also called the Third Battle of Ypres. The British had been in the town of Ypres since 1915, and the Germans held the only ridge in the area, and that was the Passchendaele Ridge. And the battlefield was in really low-lying ground and at a really high water table, so it was constantly... if you see pictures, you can Google pictures, of course, from Passchendaele. People are up to their knees in mud, and you're trying to kind of pull people out of the mud that's sucking them down, and trying to get wounded men out of the line of fire, and just absolutely covered in mud and dead bodies in the mud and dead horses in the mud. It's just a nightmare. So the Germans had actually retreated from that part of the battlefield and up to the ridge, and they were trying to kind of pull the Allies forward. And the Brits and the Aussies and the New Zealanders had been there for about 3 months and had really terrible losses. And then they captured the ridge, and all that was left was this little area behind it, this little town behind it, and it was the Canadians that were involved in that last attack. And it took from, I think, October the 25th till November the 6th of that particular year. And it doesn't break. Again, it's the same kind of thing. You know, it's important, but they don't kind of follow it up. And 5 months later, the Germans took it all back, but still known as a really serious hardcore battle. And I can't remember who the guy is, but there's that movie a couple of years ago called Passchendaele. And
Isn't that a Brad Pitt movie?
No, I went there and there were some old guys with me, including my dad, and they were like, "Oh, this is great! Oh man, that's what war is really like." Yeah. So Passchendaele's another major one. So Canadians are right there, with all the in all the toughest of situations. Mm-hmm. But
what about the war losses?
Yeah, well, the Germans really didn't want to give up, as we all know. They're tenacious. And so you have the Kaiser's kind of out of the picture by this time, and it's the generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff that carry on, and they make one last attempt to win in their victory drive to take Paris in the spring of 1918, and they're turned back at the last Battle of the Marne, and then they're pushed back on all fronts. And of course, the Kaiser fled to Holland, and a new republic was declared at the town of Weimar, and a new government was installed, a civilian government installed on November the 9th, and they're the ones that signed the armistice 2 days later. So you get, of course, Remembrance Day, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And by that time, so by the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and you always, I don't know, you always feel sadder when you hear about like the last guy that got killed 3 minutes before the army. It just seems like worse when it's so close to the end. It's awful. But 6 million soldiers had marched off to war quite happily for most of them in 1914, and by 1918, 65 million men had seen active duty. This
Wow.
don't call it the Great War for nothing. So 10 million dead and about 20 million wounded. So just horrendous statistics. And if you were to look at the losses nation by nation, of course, Russia loses 2 million, just awful. The Germans lose 2 million. France loses 1.3 million, but it's had the highest percentage of available men in Europe that were lost. 1 million for the British, 500,000 for the Italians, and just over 60,000 for Canada. And that's war losses. And there are, as we talked about this at one of the other episodes, like 138,000 people wounded. Not just wounded, my knee's scuffed up and I'll be better in a month, but wounded as in I'm going to be coughing up bits of lung for the rest of my life, and mentally wounded, just awful. So it's a terrible war for everybody.
And to wrap it up, let's talk about the Halifax disaster.
Yeah, one last disaster, this time at home, and you often see it on the National Film Board vignettes, the man going, something terrible's happening. December the 6th, 1917, in the Halifax harbour, you have the French ship the Mont Blanc, and it enters the harbour loaded with explosives. It has 2,000 tons of explosives on it, and it collides with the Belgian ship, the IMO, that was leaving. So ships, of course, normally had to wait for clearances, and the IMO had been cleared to leave the night before. And so it was due out on the evening of December the 5th, and for whatever reason didn't go out that night but left the next morning without waiting for, kind of another clearance. And the ships were supposed to pass port to port, but the IMO's captain had to move over because there was an American ship right in his way, and so it put him right into the path of the French ship coming in. And so they collided, the ships went on fire, and the French crew evacuated and left the ship, so it just drifted and, of course, just went this up. And so at 9:05 on December the 6th in the morning in 1917, the ship blew up, and the blast was heard for 320 kilometres away.
Wow.
There were 2,000 people killed. The pictures of Halifax are shocking. There's nothing left standing. Everything's just bits of timber all over the place. It's just awful. So 2,000 killed, 9,000 injured, and of course thousands of people left homeless as a result of that. So that's the kind of last thing that happens for Canada. So everybody that fought in the war was scarred by the experience, and it changed a lot of people's attitudes. Workers who had just gone off or had been conscripted and sent off, or who hadn't really been all that keen to go off and fight but had gone and done it, they're not content with the kind of life that they'd lived before. When they come back, they're more or less like, we went off to fight for you, we're ready to die for you, our country, our state. Now you make sure that we don't live in slum housing and that we have a decent wage. So there's a whole kind of attitude shift. They don't want to accept the kind of rotten life that they had before. And there was just this sense that the world had undergone a deep crisis. And no wonder with the amount of loss. And you think about the physical damage to Europe as well. So the war had changed all sorts of things. So men believed when they came back that the state had an obligation to them, that it owed them something. And so you will actually see some labour unrest, and there's inflation during the war, and so there's an attempt to do something about that. And the other group that is changed by the war is women, because women are asked to come into the workforce. They start off in kind of feminine jobs, and they're asked to come into the munitions factory. They're asked to drive all sorts of things to different places. And by World War II, women are flying supply planes as well. So women are asked to come in, and they get their first taste of a bit of kind of economic freedom as well. But the understanding is that they'll go home, and they understand that it's called helping out. That's the official helping out, come to help out. And so they're not all that keen to remain in the workforce after the fact. It brings cooperation between trade unions and the government, because there are a lot of days lost to strikes at the beginning of the war, and the government has to take action against that because it's given commitments to different parts of the Allies for, you know, the amount of wheat or munitions or whatever. And the government is also, for the first time, forced to intervene in the economy and kind of cast aside the free market for exactly the same reason. If you've promised the British that you're going to have so much of this, that, and the next thing sent over to them, then you have to start kind of looking at the production and saying, well, this place has to produce this much, you have to produce this much, you have to produce this much. So you can't just kind of leave it to chance anymore. So a lot more government intervention in the market. And the government also introduces, because there's a lot of money to be made by these companies that are supplying the Allies, the government introduces the business tax. So business tax for the first time, because before that just relied on, import-export stuff. So it introduces business taxation in 1916, and then the direct tax of personal income in 1917. So if you ever wondered why this is a difficult time of the year, you know, because you have to pay your taxes, why that all started, it starts during World War I. Income tax was set at, I think, about 3%. It didn't actually apply to a lot of workers because it didn't make enough to, you know, not like now. And it was supposed to be a temporary measure, but you know, the government has so much debt to pay off after the war. It has to look after veterans. It has to provide pensions. There's all sorts of things that it really can't afford to give that up. It's always the same. Once they find a way to tax you, they're never going to go, okay, we're just going to give that up. It was good while it lasted, but you know, we don't feel we can keep doing it now. So, you know, on the brightest of notes, Canada had, as you mentioned, Team Canada had signed up over 600,000 men for over 400,000 on active duty overseas. It had planned and successfully executed that attack at Vimy Ridge. It felt like a nation. It wasn't a nation yet, not an independent nation, not quite, but it wasn't going to be all that long coming. By the early 30s, Canada would be independent in all matters. It does lead to the war, does lead to problems. Some of these we've already touched on. You get the introduction of the War Measures Act. The government will be able to use to coordinate everything and to make sure there's not too much dissent, but that will be used again, not for a long time, but it'll be used again. Income taxation, and of course the question of conscription and how divisive this is in certain parts of the country.
Lovely.
So,
go Canada.
Yeah, Team Canada. Go Vimy Ridge.
That's right.
Go Vimy Ridge.
No wonder the school's named after it.
That's right. Yeah, and they have cadets there as well.
Well, there you go.
Yeah,
makes sense, I guess.
That's the connection. Yeah. That's the connection.
There was a Guy Lafleur school that expected to have a hockey program.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Just saying.
Yeah.
All right, well, that wraps up this episode of the History Hut. Join us again for more history at a future date.
Another time, as soon as it happens.
Sometime in the future, we'll be talking more about the past.
That's right. As soon as it happens, we'll be right on it.
That's right.
We'll be like, okay, now, was it yesterday? Okay, right, it's good. We're good to go. Anything that happened yesterday will be up for grabs.
There you go.
Right. But you just don't know when yesterday is. Oh, we'll just keep that a secret,
That's a good point.
Right? Yeah, keep that a secret. Okay, bye.